Janice has been a great student to work with. She's been really knowledgeable about her topic and asked really hard questions every time she wants to know things. These are her words. She says, "I'd like to thank God for his guidance, Mr. Wade and Miss May for their dedication, my advisor, Miss Viola, all the teachers who spared time helping me practice my speech, and my friends and family." And her title is, she wants me to do it this way, "Another One Bites the Dust." The Cost of Diagnostic Overreliance in Child Psychology. Give me just a second and I'll tell you when you can start. All right, you can start when ready.
The bedroom was eerily silent. The floor was cold. And 4-year-old Rebecca Riley laid utterly still. When investigators found Rebecca's lifeless body on December 13th, 2006, the media erupted. How can a child so young die so suddenly? This was no tragic overnight accident or sudden cardiac failure. As the cameras flashed and the headlines roared, a grim truth emerged. Rebecca had not been killed by a disease, but by a diagnosis. At barely 3 years old, she had been labeled with bipolar disorder, a label that opened the door to powerful psychiatric treatments no toddler should have ever faced. Somewhere in the frenzy, one reporter's question cut through the chaos. She was 2.5 years old. There's this thing called the terrible twos. Could her behavior, in fact, be totally normal? Now, let us rewind to the clinic where this tragedy began. A pen races through a checklist, ticking off one box after another. Often fidgets, check. Easily distracted, check. Rambles excessively, check. Within such a brief span of time, a child who could barely form sentences was reduced to a diagnostic label. This is the predatory reality of a system that prioritizes convenience over curious minds. A system so overly obsessed with rapid labeling that it sacrifices healthy development in its rush to diagnose. Rebecca may have died on the 13th, but truly, the damage had begun long before that day, the moment she was stamped as a medical file. When we rely so heavily on clinical boxes instead of a whole child, are we truly healing a generation or simply containing them? The roots of child psychology began in 1896 when Leitner Whitmer opened a small clinic to help children with behavioral problems. For decades, the discipline remained a niche specialty, until the 1930s when the Nazi dictatorship forced Europe's prestigious psychologists into exile. This diaspora scattered their clinical theories across the globe, but the field's true test came with World War II. When soldiers returned home with shell shock, a sudden surge in psychological trauma exposed a pressing issue. Professionals had no common language for diagnosis. This urgent need for standardized diagnosis finally led to the 1952 launch of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM. As the DSM became psychology's universal language, its dominance fueled a staggering era of diagnosis inflation. We are witnessing a rising tide where normative childhood behaviors are rebranded as disorders. The facts speak for themselves. Between 2020 and 2025, the rate of children identified with learning disabilities doubled, while autism prevalence jumped from 1 in 150 to an alarming 1 in 36. At the same time, we see the ripple effects of this expansion, where typical developmental behaviors like shyness or fear of the dark are gradually demonized as disorders. Together, these trends point to a growing pattern where we risk overdiagnosing the experience of childhood itself. So, what exactly do we mean by diagnosis in this context? Diagnosis is a tool used to identify and classify disorders through symptoms. A key part of this is diagnostic labeling, where individuals are classified to a diagnostic category. However, as we know, diagnosis inflation has taken hold of the field, the growing tendency of labeling normal variations of human behavior and emotions as disorders. To fix this, we must pivot to a holistic approach, a joined-up perspective that sees the child within their environment and prioritizes the interconnection of physical, social, emotional, and spiritual factors of human development. While the DSM provided a common language the field once lacked, its overuse risks reducing the natural dynamism of childhood into a set of symptoms. Unless the field redirects its focus to child-centered development, the purpose of child psychology, that is to nurture human well-being, will be lost. This position does not seek to abolish diagnosis completely, but rather to warn against the excessive use of it. To ignore a child's holistic development is to approach the spear with closed eyes. Without attention to the whole child, there is no foundation left to nurture. Thus, child psychology should prioritize holistic development over excessive reliance on diagnostic systems for 3 reasons. First, the inherent danger of expanding diagnostic systems. Second, the risk these labels pose to a child's development and sense of self. And third, the capacity of holistic models to minimize systemic risk. First, the excessive use of diagnostic systems is dangerous, and its tendency to be exploitative enforces a corrupt nature. One primary reason is that expansions in diagnostic frameworks pathologize ordinary human experience, resulting in overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. Guy Boyson's analysis proves this. Since the 3rd edition of the DSM, requirements for a diagnosis have consistently loosened. Think of it like a strainer, where the holes just keep getting larger. When the bar for a diagnosis is lowered, the gaps in the strainer widen. This creates a trap where more children than ever are falling through and being labeled. So, what exactly do we end up with? A system that turns the milestones of childhood into symptoms of a disease. Kids are eccentric by design. During development, their behavior is often out of the ordinary, not because they're ill, but because they're still progressing. Consider 3-year-old Stevie's preschool debut. He is super energetic, dynamic, and hasn't quite mastered sitting crisscross applesauce. A teacher might see a deficit, but Stevie is simply just a child who hasn't learned restraint. When we rush a child like Stevie into an institution the moment he fails to sit still, we aren't just making a mistake. We are locking millions of healthy children into a diagnostic vacuum, labeling them before they even have the chance to grow into their own skin. Next, the framework is heavily influenced by practicality and efficiency, placing diagnosis as a simple solution. By standardizing the manual to a high degree, the DSM acts as a clinical cookie cutter that leaves little room for the complexity of a child. This shortcut culture is intensified by client pressure for immediate answers, pushing clinicians to diagnose. Studies show that up to 20% of psychotherapists diagnose ADHD, and 58% diagnose autism, despite unmet criteria. However, pressure should not be an excuse. As professionals in the field, rationality is significant in decision-making. When an expert decides to please a demanding client despite knowing criteria is not met, pragmatism shines through, discarding honesty and authenticity. These shortcuts don't just appear in the blink of an eye. they stem from the system's administrative influences. So, last but not least, the diagnostic framework, being a bureaucratic institution, paves way for those holding systemic power to be driven by economic and institutional motives. Drug companies, in particular, love to exploit the fact that these manuals have no biological markers. Think about it. There is no blood test for being high energy or exuberant. Because the rules are so vague, corporations can easily market pills to younger audiences. Furthermore, this profit-driven model is fueled by deep financial ties between drug companies and experts drafting the DSM. By expanding diagnostic criteria, profit is put over genuine patient care. In the end, labels come first, rather than human identity. Diagnostic over-reliance harms even those correctly diagnosed. Following the first argument, diagnosis is problematic to a child's development and sense of self, as it comes with inevitable stigma, leading to unforgettable burden. Diagnosis can narrow a parent's perception of a child, causing them to view the child primarily through a stigmatizing label, thereby undermining autonomy and development. Diagnosis often transforms parental optimism into limited expectations or excessive control. We know that this protective instinct is born from love. But honestly, it's a risky strategy. By keeping training wheels on, parents fight their children's battles, effectively snatching away a child's competence and autonomy. For starters, let's take a look at Leo, a boy with severe autism. Because authorities deemed him incapable, his aggression went unchecked. He threw objects everywhere, recklessly. No one expected better. But when a coach set clear, respectful boundaries, he met them instantly. Leo didn't lack the ability to behave. He lacked a system that believed he could. His story proves that many limitations aren't inherent. They're socially imposed. If we use diagnostic labels as an excuse to eradicate every struggle, how exactly will a child learn to grow? Second, a diagnosis puts the child at risk of social disadvantage, which affects their future attributes and life chances. Diagnostic labels open the door to social alienation, where being called weird or strange sets off bullying, cutting them off from building essential social skills. But it goes way deeper than just being left out. Diagnosis also invites social stigmatization, where low intelligence and unreliability become closely linked to mentally ill children, leading to real-world discrimination. We must remember that belonging to a child is what oxygen is to the body. When kids are constantly called derogatory terms like retard or freak, they internalize that venom, increasing self-consciousness and destroying self-worth. Third, diagnosis creates self-fulfilling prophecies, posing threats to a child's self-concept and self-identity. This starts with a rupture of the self, a moment where the simple safety of knowing who you are suddenly vanishes. Children begin to view themselves as inferior, and these perceptions follow them into adulthood, hurting their careers and relationships. When we bombard children with low expectations, we are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me lay out the script we read for them. We begin by telling children they have a disorder, and then we warn parents to expect failure. Then we prepare teachers to anticipate disruptive behavior. And so it goes, they struggle. Shocking, right? It's truly a harsh irony. While neurotypicals rise because we expect more from them, neurodivergents fall because we expect less. Imagine if we subjected typical children to this constant expectation of failure. They too would likely internalize that negative behavior. To break this cycle of stigma means moving beyond diagnosis and focusing on child-centered care. This leads to my third argument. Holistic development's core mission to address all aspects of a child's life minimizes risk and supports more adaptive outcomes across systems. First and foremost, within a holistic framework, diagnosis should function as one of several supportive tools among many, rather than the primary basis of child psychological assessment. Childhood development occurs within multiple contexts. It happens in families, schools, and communities. That's why a biomedical approach where we treat every disorder as brain diseases that need a pill just doesn't work. To truly help a child, we must adopt a biopsychosocial focus, looking at the biological, social, and psychological factors together. Let me walk you through the process. We begin by gathering pieces of a child, bringing together family experiences, teacher observations, and performance tests. Then, trade this single clinician opinion with continuous collaboration among professionals. With contextual considerations backing up a diagnosis, practitioners will avoid the clinical errors of flawed intervention plans or inappropriate medication. Additionally, a holistic approach enhances the quality of life of the whole family by fostering coordinated care and more adaptive reading of a child's needs. By viewing the family as a whole circle, this model builds a bridge of trust between parents and professionals. In this collaborative space, parents aren't just bystanders. They are empowered partners who help create that actually resonate with their child's life. This shifts the caregiver's role from trying to fix a broken child to supporting a growing one. This serves a dual purpose. It helps parents of diagnosed children embrace growth and autonomy while protecting parents of at-risk children from the trap of premature labeling. Finally, holistic approach enhances a child's emotional well-being through personalized care. Tailored support honors the life mission of every child, ensuring that support aligns with distinct talents and meaningful values. This flexibility allows to be specifically curated to each child's circumstances, centering their voices and experiences, rather than relying on rigid and standardized interpretations. By placing emotions at the heart of development, holism safeguards well-being while protecting children from being defined by premature labeling. Now, flip the script. Let's revisit Stevie for a moment, the boy who was so hurriedly rushed to an institution just because he couldn't sit still. Instead of seeing his high energy as an immediate deficit, a council of care will build a fuller picture of his behavior. Suddenly, Stevie is no longer treated as a problem to fix, but as a child to understand. When we do this for Stevie, we do it for the millions of other children just like him. We break down a system of cages and replace it with one where a child can truly flourish. Despite holistic development's comprehensive nature, some may argue that it risks inefficient resource allocation through its costly and time-intensive nature. This utilitarian standpoint suggests that it is more ethical to provide good enough diagnostic-led care to 100 children rather than exhaustive holistic care to only 10. But this logic is fundamentally flawed in the context of child psychology. Prioritizing quantity over quality creates a false sense of efficiency. Without addressing root causes, diagnostic models often recycle the same children back into the system through misdiagnosis. Holistic intervention may cost more upfront, but it is the only sustainable solution. It prevents a revolving door of care, ultimately reducing long-term cost by ensuring that children don't repeatedly re-enter the system. Aside from this, others argue that central diagnostic use should be kept intact, as it functions as a legal safeguard, granting children lawful protection. Critics contend that under the American Disabilities Act, a diagnosis acts as a legal shield, protecting children from exclusion and discrimination. They claim that a diagnostic label is a small price to pay for the security of civil rights. However, legal protection doesn't always guarantee freedom from stigma. To qualify for civil rights in the first place, children are forced to adopt a deficit-based identity. Consequently, the very label intended to protect them can simultaneously undermine their well-being. When a child internalizes these stereotypes during a highly dynamic period of development, a diagnosis becomes a permanent marker of limitation rather than a tool for support. In this thesis, we have unmasked the dangers of an excessive reliance on diagnostic systems, the bitter reality that these systems can betray the very children they claim to help. We've allowed a culture of convenience to stain a child's development with a live load of stigma. But there is a better way, a holistic approach that reclaims the field's original purpose, nurturing the whole child. They say, a river creates its own path. If you dam it to control the flow, you lose the river's soul. Childhood is the same. When we over-pathologize a child, we are building a dam that holds back their natural flow and the liveliness of their spirits. We obstruct human flourishing. To truly honor a child's soul, we must step beyond the walls of simplistic diagnosis and find our way back to holistic waters. So, what happens when we finally let go of this suffocating reliance on diagnosis? We find nurtured capacities instead of neglected ones. We move away from a one-size-fits-all approach towards something more personal. But the professionals cannot fix this alone. This shift starts with you. We must advocate for schools and communities that honor a child's uniqueness rather than administrative convenience. Change the narrative. Remind those around you that kids are humans, not checklists that need to be ticked. After all, I heard it through the grapevine that kids are people, not categories, and they are getting a little tired of waiting for the experts to notice. Thank you.
Really good job, Janice. We've got our panelists today are Mr. Trevor and our own child psychologist, Ms. Prue. Mr. Trevor, you can go first.
Hey, Janice.
Hi, Mr.
First of all, great job. I thought you did really well presenting this information. I'll be honest, just reading your thesis, I was intrigued. I was excited to learn more. And I'm going to come into this conversation hesitantly for two reasons.
Okay.
Number one, it's clear that you know more than me about this topic, which is exactly what we're looking for.
Right.
Number two, this can be a sensitive subject, so I'm going to try my best to phrase things delicately as to not offend people who might be viewing this later on who have kind of personal investment in this topic. So, with that being said, why did you choose this topic?
Okay, so the reason why I chose this topic is because I think, especially nowadays, we can see a lot of people, especially teenagers maybe, kind of self-diagnosing themselves and thinking that they have certain disorders when it's just basic symptoms like, oh, maybe I can't sit still, maybe I can't really focus doing my homework and stuff like that. And so I specifically picked children as well because I think children are really interesting human beings. Like, they're going through a developmental stage, right? So I think that instead of adults, children would be a more interesting take to look at.
So, for example, a student has difficulty focusing in class. They often find themselves getting bored with the material, and they go, well, I must just have some sort of attention deficit disorder, and they just kind of chalk it up to, their own self-diagnosis as opposed to really considering, well, do I have any proof for that, or, is it just simply a lack of discipline on my part? That was the main thing that you were seeing that led you to go, no, I want to know more about kind of an overdiagnosis, not just the self, but like actual institutions diagnosing things that probably don't need to be diagnosed as a specific disorder. Is that fair?
Yes, exactly. And also, I think a lot of people who are self-diagnosing themselves are not really realizing like the detrimental effects of what it actually feels like to have a label. It's like not as easy as like, oh, I have ADHD. It's way deeper than that, so that's what everyone has to realize.
Sweet. Okay, now this is where things can get a little bit dark, but I am curious. So you begin your thesis and your speech with the story of Rebecca Riley, and you make the case that it is because she was diagnosed with, I believe, bipolar disorder at such a young age that ultimately resulted in her death. what was the actual like cause of death? Like what actually ended her life, and how is the diagnosis of bipolar disorder the direct like cause of or lead to that cause of death?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the question. I acknowledge that Rebecca died from an overdose of psychiatric drugs at age 4. But then again, remember that a diagnosis will inevitably open the door to these psychotropic medications. And with overdiagnosis comes overprescription. Could maybe elaborate. Rebecca Riley prescribed with 3 different types of medication. She was prescribed with Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic, and then Depakote, and then Clonidine. And these combination of 3 medications were not FDA approved. It's like not appropriate for her age. It was only supposed to be given for children 10 years old and above. Meanwhile, she was literally 2 years old, right? So because of that, yes, the case of death in Rebecca Riley's story may be rare. Like the overdose of psychiatric drugs may not happen to every single child, but the underlying pattern that led to her death wasn't. And that's what we should be concerned about. That's why my thesis advocates for a holistic approach rather than just strict reliance on diagnosis, because it can lead to serious repercussions. And obviously, we wouldn't want that for any child, right?
So she was overdosed on prescribed medicines specifically
Yes.
to treat what had been a diagnosed disorder. Okay. Yeah, that was, I don't know if I just missed it or that was a little bit unclear, but I was kind of missing the connective tissue there. But yeah, I understand the severity of that. So we talk a lot about the DSM 5TR, and you make the case, or you make the comment in your thesis that this resource, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, has come under some scrutiny and some criticism as of late. Who are the people that are criticizing this text as of late? Like, who are the parties, who are the groups that are specifically kind of pointing at this thing and saying, is this an adequate manual for our diagnostic practices?
Okay, so I think criticisms come from multiple parties. Like maybe it can come from the people themselves who got overdiagnosed and kind of experienced, like, kind of witnessed a loosening of thresholds. It can also be from the clinicians themselves who may realize from their own individual bias that, oh, these criteria in the DSM are getting looser and looser through every revision. So I think criticism comes from a variety of different people, not just like one specific person. And, yeah.
So it's both people who have been diagnosed, but also professionals in the field who are
Right.
saying these criteria are getting very slippery and it's not becoming clear, and maybe we're overdiagnosing. So it's both and.
Yeah, because like at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of people who like discern these type of things, right? And like, yeah, so
Yeah, thank you. What's next on my list? Oh, yes. So in your second confirmation, you say that, where is it? You say that diagnosis becomes problematic to a child's development and sense of self since it comes with inevitable stigma leading to an unforgettable burden. And then you go on to emphasize that a diagnosis puts the child at risk of social disadvantage, which affects their future attributes in life. And you cite a study that says that children with mental disorders are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than neurotypical children and often struggle to maintain healthy social bonds. My question is, isn't that more of an indictment of the culture itself that perpetuates stigmatization of these diagnostic labels rather than the disorder itself? Because again, if we were in a community that was understanding and accepting of neurodivergence, wouldn't those numbers go down? Wouldn't we see more acceptance and the ability for people who have disorders or just atypically wired? Wouldn't we see more acceptance in them thriving more socially? Is that really a problem with the diagnostic system, or is that a problem with just culture at large?
okay, thank you, Mr. for the question. I acknowledge like those concerns, but let me trace us back to the history of the word stigma, maybe. So stigma is, originated from ancient Greece, and it literally refers to the burnings and tattoos into the skin. And these tattoos were made to visibly show off their marks to everybody and kind of stamp them as outcasts to be avoided in public, right? So with this traced history, we can see that the very moment a person's life changed was the moment that they received the stamp, the tattoo. And I think that society definitely perpetuates the stigma and the exclusion and discrimination. But then again, the person who made the mark was the one who handed society something to judge. And I think that diagnosis is the modern equivalent to this because, again, if we look at what we have, society, yes, the prejudice, it comes from society. Who exactly opened the door to that? It's diagnosis. So I think that my thesis is kind of advocating for two different things. The first one is fewer unnecessary marks for children who don't actually need them. And then second is a fundamental shift in how we as a society interpret like these marks that already exist. Like we should ask ourselves, are we viewing these children, these diagnosed children, just as their diagnosis, as their whole identity? Or are we willing to reinterpret these marks and kind of see diagnosis as a slice of a child's way much more complex being?
So then that leads us to the question of, so how do we balance that? How do we balance an awareness that children might have certain psychological disorders while also not leading into stigmatization, leading into an outcasting and ostracizing of those people? Like, how does holistic development account for culture's response to those things? Because again, it's only the family can only do so much. Again, we have to enter these children into society, and if our cultures, if our communities are not well prepared, that's going to inevitably happen, or at least that's what you would say is going to be inevitability. They're going to be ostracized. They're going to be outcast. How does holistic development account for that?
Okay, so I think it's really important to kind of trace back to the values. Again, in a diagnostic system, in a purely diagnostic system, values are really centered to just like categories and kind of categorizing children into specific disorders, right? But then with a holistic approach, the value is something that is way more personal, and that is the wholeness of the child. In a holistic approach, we focus on nurturing their spiritual aspects, their social emotional, their physiological well-being. And so because of that, the change of value already marks something different. It already kind of signals a shift in how we approach children and how we view children. Because in a holistic approach, we don't ask, oh, what order does this child have? We are asking, what is this child struggling with? And how can we help this child kind of heal and kind of embrace their struggles?
Okay, we need to move on to Ms. Prue.
Hi, Janice.
Hi, Miss.
Let me just make a disclaimer and say, like, I didn't voluntarily sign up for this, people, okay? I did not voluntarily sign up for this. So, like, it's nice to be reminded that I'm a child psychologist because, like, at this point, even I forget. So thank you guys to remember that I'm a child psychologist. So I would like to appreciate two major things. First of all, I actually agree with a good 90% of what you've been saying, honestly speaking. So I appreciate that you take on this stance. And it's very comforting because I have really, really good mentors during my education in which they try their very best to implement a very holistic system. So I appreciate that professionally, and I appreciate it personally also because it made a lot of sense on why my partner discussed a lot about neurodivergence in the past few months. So I appreciate that a lot.
Okay, thank you, Miss.
But unfortunately, my role today is to be a devil's advocate. Again, I'm not trying to hurt you, child, okay? I'm not against you, child, all right? Let me be clear on that for the love of everything. Okay. So, I need to clarify again, when you're mentioning diagnostic system, are you specifically seeing like the whole idea of a diagnosis, so it's like the whole DSM, or are you specifically looking at the neurodevelopmental disorders, which you mentioned a lot, or are you looking at the NDD and the mood disorders? You know, like, tell me where is like your brain right now in like saying diagnostics as a whole, or what?
Okay, thank you for the question, Miss. So when I'm targeting the diagnostic system, I'm kind of targeting the DSM because of its inconsistencies. I'm also targeting the child psychologists who fall into this trap of diagnostic pressure. So that's mostly what I'm. So technically the field.
Right. So it's very general in a big sense. Okay. So let me just share a little bit. What you wrote is like very valid in so many perspectives. And admittedly, I had like a few moments in which I went in the process of reading, not because I disagree with the reality, but I'm also aware of a different kind of reality, which is I'm a child psychologist practicing in an Eastern world, in which, in comparison to the overdiagnostics of the Western world, the Eastern world tends to avoid it like they're the plague. So the stigmatization happens even before the tattoos were created. So, what would be your perspective and perhaps input based on your argument in a situation where the society underdiagnoses?
Okay, so I acknowledge that in a lot of countries like Indonesia, the problem is underdiagnosis and not overdiagnosis, right? Because in the USA, for example, its history already traces back way like 2 centuries ago, and like these soldiers got diagnosed with PTSD. That's why like they created the DSM and stuff like that. And I know they have the first mover advantage, and we don't. So it's kind of different for us here. So with underdiagnosis, I believe that a holistic approach can actually better serve for a country like us. Because number one, our diagnostic system isn't properly built yet. I am well aware that in Indonesia, we don't have a concrete diagnostic system. And because of that, unlike USA, who already has concrete systems, we have time to kind of bridge out and kind of like incorporate more holistic values into the system rather than just jumping straight into the normal like American diagnostic system and stuff like that. So
That's a good answer. Honestly, that's a very good answer.
thank you.
In response to your criticism of pressure and all that, one of the things that come out in my discussion with my other professional friends is that they are under the pressure of having to come up with a diagnosis, even here in Indonesia, simply because of insurance claims. So the system, the healthcare system, I don't know about in the States, I'm not an American. But in Indonesia, if you don't have a diagnosis written down formally by a professional, even heck, they don't sometimes even look at a psychologist, they require a pediatrician, because apparently psychologists are second-class healthcare, something like that. Anyways, but the diagnosis is necessary for an insurance claim. So do you have like perhaps an idea or an input or I don't know from what you read that may be able to help ease this pressure off for like my fellow professional friends?
Okay, so in my paper, I mentioned about diagnostic pressure, and I mentioned the statistics like 15 to 20% of psychotherapists diagnose ADHD and 58% diagnose autism, right? But I strictly believe that pressure shouldn't be an excuse for professionals because I know that it kind of is comforting to just give a label because it eases a parent's anxiety, but then we have to remember the long-term effects of what this could do for the child. Because diagnostic pressure isn't just giving a child a label and then they go home with the label and it works wonders for them, right? It will come with overprescription. It will come with the stigma surrounding the label. So it's really important to put that in mind because giving a label to ease a parent's anxiety isn't compassion. That's just convenience, right? So maybe to kind of help clinicians reduce this pressure, I can try to remind them the value in the first place, like why did you become a child psychologist? And I know this might sound like a very idealistic take, but again, value. And if we don't consider that, then all of our actions, everything that we do that we inflict on the child will not be out of like passion and love, but out of standardization and out of practicality and out of convenience. So yeah, I think it really comes back to value, and yeah.
Okay. Diplomatic. Love it. I love it. Right. So we have overdiagnosing, too early diagnosing, and we have that discussion of underdiagnosing. And so let's talk about the other side of the issue of not diagnosing, which is late diagnosing. So I'm part of the group of late diagnosing. I spent 7 years in psychology and nobody diagnosed with me ADHD, situation. Even to the point that I have to walk myself into a pediatrician's office because a psychologist will not diagnose. If you're looking for a psychologist in Indonesia, guys, don't look for a diagnosis. So there is a big issue of late diagnosing in which as they don't even fall through the cracks. Okay, we don't fall through the cracks to the point that whatever you mentioned about stigmatization, bullying, so these people have been bullied their whole life, have been labeled their whole life as freaks and weirds for their whole life, to only come up in like adulthood or late teens to be like, oh, I'm ADHD. Oh, I'm autistic. So what would you propose in your arguments and in your research in response to the phenomenon of late diagnosing? Because without a diagnostic system, then the numbers of late diagnosed people would increase, and perhaps there's no social labeling and they improve, reach many great places, but they have severe anxiety because they always think it's their fault.
Okay, thank you for the question. So maybe I would like to clarify that holistic approach doesn't mean allowing early intervention, because we can do early intervention through a holistic take. So, for example, when a child is displaying certain ADHD symptoms, like they can't sit still or like they're struggling to kind of constrain themselves, there is actually a specific therapy that we can do called executive function therapy. So basically, executive function refers to the brain management system, and in this therapy, we can help children kind of regulate how they respond to the environment and how to follow instructions and kind of like manage and organize their own schedules and stuff like that. So instead of a straight diagnosis that will label them and can also reap inaccurate results, right? Because, for example, 3-year-olds are still very impulsive and reckless. That just can be like a developmental trait, right? So this executive function therapy will help train them and equip them with the skills rather than a quick stamp.
Time is actually up. You did a great job, Janice. Okay, we want friends and family up here and panelists and advisor for photos with Janice. Come back at 12:55. 12:55. We've got lunch provided out here at the tables.